Hi, my name is Pat, and this is my channel, Book Chat with Pat, and I'm glad that you're here. Today I'm going to be talking about my bookish pedigree, or my bookish family. I was tagged some months ago by David at Polyglot Reading, and I was also more recently tagged by Leslie at Books, Gers, and Purrs. David originally discovered this tag on Margherita's channel in the Italian booktube community. If you know David, he has multiple booktube channels that he conducts in several different languages. So he discovered this in the Italian booktube community, and it was originally created by Elena at Elena Monti. So I'm just going to read what David wrote on his video and what he said in his presentation. He said, "In this tongue-in-cheek video, I would like to introduce you to my bookish pedigree. What writers have shaped me as a reader and as a person? What is my connection to these authors? What did they teach me?" And in David's video, he talked about his literary parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, and siblings. I also saw some time ago a version of this by Aaron Facer, who also talked about grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles and even a mad uncle, I believe. It was just a lot of fun to hear people talking about writers that have influenced them. So I thought I would give this a go. I am also doing parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles and siblings. Okay, I don't think I didn't go back to great grandparents. Okay, so it may come as no surprise that I would describe my literary father as J.D. Salinger and my literary mother as Harper Lee. And I'm just going to talk about why that is. I've talked about J.D. Salinger a number of times. Usually I'm talking about The Catcher in the Rye, but I'm not talking about that today. I discovered J.D. Salinger when I was in the 8th grade, and I believe that he was the first author whom I read where I then immediately had to go out and read everything that he had ever written, at least everything that we knew of that he had written at that time. And so I think that was, I was 13, I was in the 8th grade. That was the beginning of my very serious study of literature. I fell in love with my English class in 8th grade, though I didn't read Salinger in class. I fell in love with writing. I was led to believe that I had some talent in that area, and I think that my future, my fate was sealed. I knew I was going to major in English and probably be an English teacher. I've talked about my connection to Harper Lee in many videos, but it was discovering Harper Lee when I was in around the 4th grade that I suddenly felt passionate about reading. I've talked many times about discovering this book, To Kill a Mockingbird, on my parents' bookshelf and racing home after school every day so that I could continue reading it. And I'm sure I was too young to be reading it then, but I fell in love with the world of that novel. And so I think those two, one in 4th grade and one in 8th grade, kind of determined what kind of a reader I was going to be for the rest of my life. Okay, my paternal grandfather. I would say that my paternal grandfather is Charles Dickens. This is a very old copy of A Tale of Two Cities. This is not the first Dickens novel that I read. Probably the first Dickens novel that I read was A Christmas Carol, and then Great Expectations, and then Bleak House, I think, was next in college. The reason I'm showing A Tale of Two Cities was that this was the first Dickens novel that I ever taught. And I learned that I was going to be teaching it the summer after I graduated from college, and I had the summer to prepare for my first year of teaching. And I read this book cover to cover probably 3 times that summer, just figuring out how I was going to teach this. I think that I have learned, I think the books that I have come to know the best are the books that I prepared for teaching and for presenting to young people. And so they have had a profound, impact on my life. I've probably talked about Bleak House in other videos as well. I read that as a sophomore in college, and since that time, in 1979, I think, I've read it almost every year. It's a book that I come back to over and over again. I said that my maternal grandfather is Hemingway. And I guess I have a couple of reasons for that, and some have to do with my own real family of birth, but a lot of these reasons have to do with my teaching career. I had read Hemingway first in high school. I read The Old Man and the Sea and The Sun Also Rises in 10th grade, and I fell in love with this book. And for a long time, this was my favorite Hemingway novel. Hemingway was my mother's favorite author, and so I always knew that I would read all of Hemingway just because my mother loved Hemingway. The same summer that I learned that I was going to be teaching A Tale of Two Cities, I also learned that I was going to be teaching a Hemingway seminar. I was a first-year teacher. I was 21 years old, and I was going to be teaching all of the works of Hemingway, or the then known works. A few came out a little bit later than that, but I was going to be teaching a Hemingway seminar to juniors and seniors in high school. And so that same summer that I was reading A Tale of Two Cities over and over again, I read the complete works of Ernest Hemingway. I've had my difficulties with some of Hemingway's works and some aspects of Hemingway's life, I think. But The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms will always be really, really special and important books in my life. And the fact that my mother loved Hemingway so much has just made him somebody really important to me as well. Okay, my paternal grandmother would be Emily Bronte, Wuthering Heights. And, similar to, I guess, what I'm saying for a lot of these books were firsts for me. First encounter with an author, first encounter with a particular type of book. And I read Wuthering Heights in high school. I remember we had a choice of about 6 19th century novels to choose from, and we had to read them on our own and then do some kind of a project. And I chose Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. And it's another book that I just fell in love with. I don't remember the project that I did on it, but I remember it had something to do with the families and the different houses. but it just had a profound impact on me. All of these books that I read, as a teen, as a young person, were books that told me that I was a serious reader. By the time I was in 11th grade, I was well on my way to looking for English programs, to in schools that I was interested in. I knew what I was going to be studying, but I think it was Emily Bronte had a big part in that. I would go on to read all of the Brontes, but that was the first. My maternal grandmother is Louisa May Alcott, Little Women, which I've talked about. I've talked about this particular edition in another recent video. This was a book that I read for the first time when I was 8 years old. It was my mother's favorite book growing up, and she gave it to me that summer, the summer that I was 8 years old. And as with many of these, I can remember where I was when I read it. I can remember what it felt like to read it. I think my mother already knew that I was a reader, but I don't know if I knew it. I knew it after I read Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. Okay. I also have a group of paternal aunts and uncles and maternal aunts and uncles. And these are writers also that have resonated with me powerfully and sent me on quests to read everything else or almost everything else that they had written. So I'll talk about my paternal uncles first. Okay, I have a bunch of them. One paternal uncle would be Albert Camus, The Stranger. Again, the same year that I was reading Wuthering Heights in an English class, I also read this. I found a copy of this at a used book sale at my local public library. I read it for an independent reading project. I was mesmerized by it, and I chose to do my independent research in junior English on this. And I ended, not on just on this, on all of the works of Camus, and I ended up writing some gigantic sort of thesis paper, research paper, that, again, it was just this project that I thoroughly immersed myself in. So here's Uncle Al. I'm going to talk about this book in an upcoming episode of my books I love to teach. This was one that I would go on to teach as well. Another paternal uncle, of course, would be J.R.R. Tolkien. I mean, I read The Hobbit as a little kid. I've talked many times about my brother giving me the box set that included the trilogy and The Hobbit, all of which I read as an 8th grader and fell in love with. But I felt like, Uncle J.R. opened up whole new worlds for me. Another paternal uncle would be Uncle Art, Arthur Miller. And he is a playwright that I encountered for the first time in high school, but would encounter him over and over again. The Crucible, I think I read for the first time in the 10th grade. Death of a Salesman, I read for the first time in 11th grade. But I would go on to read many, I haven't read all of his plays, but I've read many of his plays. And these are two that I also taught throughout most of my career. So that was probably the first playwright that I encountered seriously and passionately. And I also have a paternal uncle on the Irish side, James Joyce. I probably read Dubliners first, then Portrait of the Artist, uh, then Ulysses several times, and I think Alan at Big Hard Books and Classics is twisting my arm. I think I'm going to read Finnegan's Wake this year, even though I said never. But this was my introduction to Irish literature, and that's become a passion of mine, as I've talked about probably ad nauseum. I apologize if it's getting old. Okay, I also have maternal uncles. All of these are writers that just, when I read the first work by them, it resonated so deeply with me that I had to go and read more of what they had written. In some cases, I think I've read everything that they've written. So in 10th grade, I read The Great Gatsby for the first time by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I fell in love with this book. It was assigned on a Friday and it was due on a Monday. And I just remember going home that Friday and reading it, and I couldn't put it down, and I fell in love with it. And this was also a book that I would go on to teach for many years as well. And I think I've read everything that Fitzgerald has written. I guess all of my maternal uncles, interestingly, are American authors. It's interesting. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. Probably, I think this is my favorite of all of his novels. I don't think I've read everything that Steinbeck has written, but I've certainly read many. I think the first that I read was probably the first that most kids read. I read The Red Pony, The Long Valley, and Of Mice and Men, all in high school. I didn't read The Grapes of Wrath in high school. I didn't read this until later. I think post-college. I don't think I read this in college, but this is also a novel that I taught for many, many years. Great, one of the greatest American novels ever written. When I was 18 years old, I discovered John Irving. I actually discovered John Irving with The World According to Garp, but he became a favorite author of mine, an automatic buy author of mine. Anything he comes out with, I buy and I read. So he's one of those. I felt like when I read Garp, like I had entered into another world. I loved the world that he created, and I, excuse me, I went on, to just read him voraciously. This is the only author I can remember reading when I was in college, reading for pleasure. When I was taking 3 and 4 English courses at a time, and I had so much to read all the time, I could actually put things aside and read John Irving just for fun. It's the only author I remember doing that with when I was a student. A Prayer for Owen Meany is a novel that I taught to seniors in high school. I'll do a separate video on this cherished book. Okay, now we're on to aunts. In my real life, I had, on both my mother's side and my father's side, I had wonderful aunts, and they were figures of strength in my life and figures of great comfort. So I'm going to talk about some women writers who I see in that same way. So my paternal aunts are Kate Chopin, The Awakening, Jane Austen, of course, Pride and Prejudice, and Agatha Christie. And as you know, I'm reading all of the Miss Marple stories and novels right now. Kate Chopin and Jane Austen were two authors that I taught. When I was studying literature in college in the 70s and the early 80s, we did not read a lot of female authors. We read the Brontes and we read Jane Austen, but we didn't read anybody else, and we certainly didn't read anybody contemporary. I've talked in a bunch of different videos about the importance in curriculum and in literature of having windows and mirrors. You know, we read so that we can see other worlds, we can see out the window and see how others live or lived, and we read because we need to see mirrors and we need to see our stories reflected sometimes also, and we need stories that resonate with all of us. And so, you know, for that reason, I've been drawn, you know, all my life to strong female authors. So Chopin, Austen, Agatha Christie certainly would be three. And my maternal aunts, also very strong female authors. Amanda Cross, who this is the pen name for Carolyn Heilbrunn, who was a literary scholar. I did a separate video just on the Amanda Cross novels. That would be one. And her character is an English teacher, so you can see where that series served as kind of a mirror for me. In graduate school, I was introduced to Zora Neale Hurston, the Harlem Renaissance writer. Their eyes were watching God, and I fell in love. Probably my favorite female author of all time, Toni Morrison, beloved. I've done a separate video on this novel and why it's so important and why it shouldn't be banned in all of the places that it's being banned. And as I've talked about in many, many videos, Mary Oliver, one of my favorite poets. So those are my strong women voices and my and my comfort voices as well. And then finally, I've got a bunch of siblings in this family. So what I did for siblings was I just picked male and female authors who are contemporary authors. They are, except for one, they are all writing now. And they are people more or less of my generation, and so I think they they speak to me in a in a particular way where I can really identify, I guess, to some degree with their experiences. I can appreciate their experiences. I can just get totally lost in the worlds that they have created, and I'm always excited to see what they're going to produce next. So my brothers are Amor Towles, and I just think he's a wonderful, wonderful contemporary novelist. I've been reading him very seriously. I have only one more of his books that I need to read. We've all been talking about Percival Everett this year. Such an important novelist who is finally getting his long-deserved recognition and attention. Someone that I've discovered just in the last 2 years, I would say, is William Kent Kruger. I've just started to make my way through his body of work, but he's going to become, I think, an automatic buy author for me. And James McBride. And this is just a really, really important contemporary author. I loved his Deacon, King Kong. I also loved The Heaven and Earth grocery store. And I think it was due much more recognition than it got. Okay, my sisters. These are all women of a certain age. These are my contemporaries in life. Alice McDermott. The book of hers that I most recently read was Absolution. This is an older one of her novels, which I think this one won the National Book Award. But every time I read an Alice McDermott novel, I wish that I could call her up and go out for coffee with her. She feels like a friend. Barbara Kingsolver. I've been reading Barbara Kingsolver since the 1980s. I'm going to say the late 80s. Louise Penny. Automatic buy author. Louise Erdrich. Probably one of my 2 or 3 favorite novelists, living novelists. And this is a writer that I just discovered last year, who sadly is no longer with us, though she too is a woman of my generation, and that's Nuala O'Fuailon. And I read, this is her memoir. I don't remember if I read this for the Irish Readathon last year or if I read this for the memoir event in April. But this got me started in a deep dive into finding all of her works and her journalism as well, and reading my way through those last spring and this summer also. So that is my literary family. This is really interesting. This is really fun to do. I'm going to tag a bunch of people in the notes if anybody else wants to do this. I think this is a really, really fun exercise to think about, what writers made us the readers that we are today. So I have a whole bunch of people that I'm going to tag, and if you're interested in this and you would like to do this, I hope that you will do it, whether I listed your name or not. So, as always, I thank you for watching. I hope that you're doing well. I'll speak with you again soon. Take care.